Part 1. The galaxy had known peace for 300 years. The Galactic Peacekeeping Coalition kept order across 12 star systems with quiet efficiency. Their security forces were the best trained in known space. Their technology was beyond anything most species could imagine. They had solved problems that younger civilizations could not even name. Then the Hollow came, and everything changed. Commander stood before the observation window of Coalition Station Prime, watching the distant stars with all four of her pale blue eyes. Behind her, the tactical display showed another world gone dark. That made 7 in the past 2 months. 7 planets lost to an enemy they could not fight. The Hollow were not like other threats. They did not come with ships or weapons. They came through the mind itself. They found the cracks in a person's thoughts, the small fears and hidden doubts, and they pushed through those cracks like water through stone. Once inside, they fed on terror until nothing remained but empty shells that walked and breathed but no longer truly lived. Every species the Coalition sent against them fell within days. The Sown people were beings of pure logic and crystalline thought. They should have been immune to such attacks. Instead, the Hollow twisted their perfect reasoning into impossible loops. The soldiers simply stopped, caught in paradoxes they could not solve, until the fear consumed them whole. They lasted even less time. They were ancient and wise, connected to each other through a vast collective consciousness. The Hollow infected one mind and spread to all the others in hours. An entire colony world fell silent in a single night. Turned away from the window, her second-in-command, a compact named, waited by the door. His gray fur was pressed flat against his skull, a sign of deep stress. "The Council has reached a decision," said. His voice was steady, but his small dark eyes would not meet hers. "They have approved the contact protocol." Felt something twist in her chest. The contact protocol. She had read the proposal herself and thought it was madness, but madness was all they had left. "Prepare a diplomatic vessel," she said. "I will lead the mission myself." The journey to the edge of the galaxy took 11 days. Spent most of that time studying the files that the Coalition's analysts had prepared. The files described a species that made no sense to her. Humans, they were called. They came from a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. By Coalition standards, they were barely out of their infancy. They had only just begun reaching beyond their own world. Their technology was crude. They were short. They fought wars among themselves with disturbing regularity. And yet the analysts had flagged them as potentially useful against the Hollow. The reason was simple and strange. Humans had a relationship with fear that no other known species shared. Read the reports 3 times to make sure she understood them correctly. Humans did not simply experience fear. They sought it out. They created entire industries around the experience of terror. They paid currency to sit in dark rooms while images of monsters flashed before their eyes. They told stories to their children about creatures that lurked in shadows and ate the unwary. They jumped from high places for entertainment. They explored dark caves. They swam in waters filled with predators. It made no biological sense. Fear was supposed to be a warning system, a signal that something was wrong. Any rational species would minimize their exposure to such an unpleasant sensation, but humans seemed to treat it as recreation. The Coalition's top psychologists had spent months studying human media and behavior patterns. Their conclusion was unanimous. Humans had evolved not to avoid fear, but to function within it. Their entire civilization had been built by creatures who were constantly, chronically afraid, and who had learned to keep moving anyway. The diplomatic vessel entered Earth's solar system on the 12th day, looked at the small blue world growing larger in the, and felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as nervousness. She had not felt nervous in decades. Dr. Sarah was in the middle of a lecture when the silver craft descended onto the quad. She was explaining the neurological basis of anxiety responses to a room full of graduate students. The topic suddenly became much more relevant. She watched through the window as her students scattered in panic, then slowly gathered again at a safe distance. A few of them had their phones out, recording. That was very human, she thought. Even in the face of the unknown, the impulse to document. The craft was beautiful in an unsettling way. Its surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. No seams, no windows, no obvious means of propulsion. Sarah had spent her career studying how the human mind processed the unfamiliar, and she found herself automatically cataloging her own responses. Elevated heart rate, sweating palms, a tightness in her chest that wanted to become panic. She took a deep breath and walked outside. The being that emerged from the craft was tall and thin, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on a face that was almost, but not quite, human in shape. Its skin had a faint iridescent quality, like oil on water. It wore something that might have been a uniform or might have been part of its body. Sarah noted that her hands were shaking slightly. She also noted that she was still walking forward. "Dr. Sarah," the being said. Its voice was surprisingly gentle. "I am commander of the Galactic Peacekeeping Coalition. I have come to offer you a position." Sarah blinked. Of all the things she had expected an alien to say, that was not on the list. A position. "A consultancy," said. "My people face a threat we cannot overcome. Our analysts believe that your species may be uniquely qualified to help us." "What kind of threat?" 4 eyes flickered in a pattern that Sarah could not interpret. "An enemy that attacks through the mind, through fear itself. Every species we send against them falls. They cannot function while afraid." Sarah thought about that for a moment. "And you think humans can?" "Your species has spent 200,000 years learning to operate while terrified." Gestured toward the gathered students who were still filming from behind benches and trees. "Even now, faced with the completely unknown, they document rather than flee. They approach rather than retreat. This is not normal behavior, not by galactic standards." Sarah looked back at her students. A few of them waved. She almost laughed. "We need consultants," continued. "Humans who understand fear not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a companion to be managed. We need teachers who can show other species how to be afraid and still function. Will you help us?" Sarah thought about her quiet office, her comfortable routine, the lecture she had been in the middle of giving. She thought about all the years she had spent studying fear from a safe academic distance. Then she thought about the look in 4 eyes. It was the look of someone who had run out of options. Someone who was, for perhaps the first time in her long life, genuinely afraid. "How long do I have to decide?" Sarah asked. "I can give you 3 days to settle your affairs." 3 days, to leave behind everything she knew, to step into a universe she could not begin to imagine, to face dangers that had broken entire civilizations. Sarah felt her heart racing. She felt the sweat on her palms. She felt the tight knot of fear in her chest that had been there since the moment the silver craft touched down. She also felt something else, something that might have been excitement, or maybe it was just another kind of fear, the fear of missing something important. "I'll need to make some phone calls," she said, "and I'll need to pack a bag." 4 eyes widened slightly. Later, Sarah would learn that this was a sign of surprise. "You are agreeing, without more information." Sarah smiled. It was a very human expression, and it seemed to confuse the alien even more. "Commander," she said, "I've spent my whole life studying what scares people and why. You're offering me the chance to do something useful with that knowledge, to actually help." She paused. "Also, I've been afraid of a lot of things in my life. I've never let it stop me before." Studied her for a long moment. Then she made a small gesture with one long hand. "Perhaps our analysts were correct," she said quietly. "Your species is very strange, Doctor." "You have no idea," Sarah replied. But you're about to find out. 3 days later, she was gone. The silver craft rose from the quad, leaving behind a scorch mark on the grass and a campus full of people who were not quite sure what had happened. The videos went viral, of course. Theories. The world waited for answers. But Sarah was already light years away, watching Earth shrink to a small blue dot among billions of stars. She was terrified. She was also, for the first time in years, completely alive. And somewhere in the dark between stars, the hollow continued to feed, unaware that something new was coming. Something that had learned to make fear into a friend. Part 2. Coalition Station, Meridian was the largest structure Sarah had ever seen. It hung in the darkness between two star systems, a vast wheel of metal and light that housed over 100,000 beings from dozens of species. She had been given 3 weeks to adjust to her new surroundings before the real work began. It was not enough time. She spent those weeks learning which corridors led where, learning which foods would not make her sick, learning the names and faces of species she had never imagined could exist. Some of them were beautiful, some of them were strange, all of them were afraid. She could see it in the way they moved. The walked too quickly, their crystalline forms flickering with nervous light. The clustered together in groups, their telepathic murmurs filling the air with a constant hum of shared anxiety. Even the smaller species, the ones Sarah had trouble telling apart at first, showed signs of stress. Restless movements, shortened conversations. The station felt like a hospital waiting room filled with people expecting bad news. Sarah's team arrived over the following weeks. Came first, a former combat medic who had served in 3 war zones and still woke up screaming some nights. Then, a horror novelist whose books had sold millions of copies and who understood fear better than most psychologists. Finally, a researcher who had spent 4 months alone in a collapsed ice station in Antarctica, surviving on rationed supplies and sheer stubbornness. They were all afraid, they were all functional, that was the point. The training sessions began in a large amphitheater near the station's center. Security officers from 17 species sat in curved rows, their various eyes and sensory organs fixed on the 4 humans standing at the front of the room. Sarah looked out at the assembled beings and felt a familiar flutter of stage fright in her chest. She let it sit there. She did not fight it. She simply began to speak. "Fear is not a malfunction," she said. Her voice was steady and she was proud of that. "I know that many of you think of it that way. Something that breaks when it should work. Something that stops you from doing what you need to do. But fear is not a flaw in your design. It is a feature." A delegate raised one geometric limb. Its voice was a series of precise tones that the translator rendered as neutral and calm. How can something that impairs function be considered a feature? "Because it is not meant to impair function," Sarah said. "It is meant to provide information. Fear is a message from your brain telling you that something important is happening, something that requires your attention. The problem is not the message. The problem is what you do with it." She gestured to who stepped forward. He was a large man with a thick beard and kind eyes that had seen too much darkness. "I spent 4 months alone in the ice," he said. His accent was thick, but his words were clear. "A storm collapsed my station. My communications were destroyed. I had limited food, limited heat, no way to call for help." The room was silent. Every being present was listening with complete attention. "I was terrified every single day," continued. "Every morning when I woke up, the fear was there, telling me I would die, telling me there was no hope, telling me to give up and let the cold take me." He paused. "But I also rationed my supplies. I maintained my equipment. I kept a journal of everything I learned about surviving in those conditions. When rescue finally came, that journal saved 6 other researchers' lives." A young in the front row spoke up. Her voice was soft and musical, and her skin shifted colors as she talked. "How did you do that? How did you function while afraid?" Smiled. It was a tired smile, but a real one. "I learned to think alongside the fear, not against it. Not through it, but with it like a partner. The fear told me what was dangerous. I listened to that part. Then I made my own choices about what to do next. The sessions continued for weeks. Ran simulations in the station's tactical training centers. He created scenarios where teams had to complete complex objectives while facing gradually escalating horrors. At first, most of the alien officers froze within seconds. The Hollow's attacks worked by overwhelming the mind with terror, and even simulated fear was enough to shut down species that had no experience managing it. But slowly, things began to change. Worked with each team individually, teaching them to recognize the physical signs of fear in their own bodies. Racing hearts, trembling limbs, the urge to flee or freeze. He taught them that these sensations were normal and survivable, that they could feel afraid and still move, still think, still fight. Took a different approach. She studied the psychological structure of fear itself, breaking it down into components that even non-human minds could understand. She taught the officers to recognize when their terror was based on real danger and when it was the result of manipulation. The Hollow did not just cause fear. They amplified it, twisted it, turned small worries into overwhelming horrors. Learning to tell the difference was crucial. Sarah developed what she called fear inoculation protocols. Controlled exposure to frightening situations, carefully calibrated to build tolerance without causing trauma. She started with small fears and worked up to larger ones. A who could not function in darkness was first exposed to dim light, then shadows, then complete blackness, always with support and always with a clear exit. It was slow work, exhausting work. There were failures along the way. Some officers could not adapt no matter how hard they tried. Some broke down and had to be sent home, but others began to change. The breakthrough came 6 weeks into the program. A young officer named had struggled from the beginning. Her species was deeply connected to each other through their collective consciousness, which meant that fear spread between them like fire through dry grass. Every time one panicked, the others felt it and panicked too. Sarah had worked with individually for hours, teaching her to build mental walls that could contain her fear without blocking her connection to her people entirely. It was delicate work, like learning to hold water in your hands without closing your fists. The simulation was a standard one. A dark corridor, strange sounds in the distance, a target at the end that needed to be reached within a time limit. Nothing that the human consultants would have found particularly challenging. Entered the simulation alone. Sarah watched through the monitoring station, her hands gripping the edge of the console. She had grown fond of the young over the weeks of training. She wanted this to work. For the first 30 seconds, nothing happened. Moved forward through the darkness, her skin flickering with nervous colors. The sounds grew louder. Shapes began to move in the shadows. Then the fear hit. Sarah saw it in the way his body went rigid, the way her colors flared bright and then went dark. Every previous attempt had ended here. The fear would build until it overwhelmed her, and she would freeze or flee or simply collapse. This time did something different. She stopped walking. She stood still in the darkness and closed her 4 eyes. Sarah could see her trembling, could see the fear rippling across her skin like waves, but she did not run. Slowly, deliberately opened her eyes again. She took a single step forward, then another, then another. She was still afraid. Sarah could see that clearly, but she was also moving, thinking, functioning. She reached the target with 12 seconds to spare and then collapsed against the wall, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Sarah was at her side within moments. "How do you feel?" Looked up at her with 4 wide eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Terrible, I feel terrible." She paused and something like wonder crept into her expression. "But I did it. I was afraid and I did it anyway." Sarah smiled and put a hand on the young officer's trembling shoulder. "That's exactly right. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, just the decision to keep going despite it." Later that night, Sarah stood at an observation window, watching the stars wheel slowly past. His breakthrough had sparked something in the other trainees. For the first time, they had seen one of their own face fear and win, not by becoming fearless, but by learning to be afraid and functional at the same time. Joined her at the window. His face was tired but satisfied. "You know they're going to face the real thing eventually," he said. "The Hollow are still out there, still taking worlds." "I know. You think they're ready." Sarah thought about trembling in the dark, about the officer who had learned to think through paradoxes without freezing, about all the small victories and slow progress of the past weeks. "No," she said honestly, "but they're more ready than they were, and we're still teaching." Nodded. Humanity's greatest contribution to the galaxy. Lessons in how to be scared out of your mind and keep working anyway. Sarah almost laughed. "We did have a lot of practice. 200,000 years of it." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars. Somewhere out there, the Hollow were waiting, hungry, patient, certain of their eventual victory because no species had ever learned to resist them. They did not know what was coming. They did not understand what the humans had begun to teach. They had never faced an enemy that had made fear into an ally. But they would learn. Soon enough they would learn. Part 3. The Hollow came to Station Meridian on a quiet night. There was no warning, no approaching fleet, no demands or declarations. One moment the station was peaceful and the next, something was wrong. Sarah felt it before she understood it, a pressure in her mind, a whisper at the edge of her thoughts. She had been sleeping in her small quarters when she woke suddenly, her heart already racing. The darkness in the room seemed thicker than it should be. The shadows in the corners seemed to move. She knew immediately what was happening. They had talked about this moment for months, trained for it, prepared for it as best they could. But knowing something was coming and facing its arrival were two very different things. She reached for her communications unit with trembling hands. "All consultants, report to command center. This is not a drill." The corridors of the station were already filled with chaos. Beings ran in every direction, their voices raised in panic. Sarah saw a group of frozen in the middle of an intersection, their crystalline bodies flickering with confused light. And Huddle had collapsed against a wall, their shared consciousness overwhelmed by the terror spreading through their link. The Hollow were everywhere and nowhere. They had no physical form, not really. They existed in the space between thoughts, in the gaps of the mind where fear lived. And once they found those gaps, they pushed through and made themselves at home. Sarah felt them pressing against her own thoughts. They pulled images from her memories, the dark closet from her childhood, the face she had seen in a window when she was 7, the one that had turned out to be just a reflection but had haunted her dreams for years, the sound of a car crash, the smell of a hospital, every fear she had ever known, dredged up and made fresh. She kept walking. Her hands were shaking. Her breath was fast and shallow. The logical part of her mind was screaming that something was very wrong, that she needed to run, that she was in terrible danger. And she was. The Hollow were inside the station, inside her head, and there was no safe place to hide. But Sarah had spent her whole life studying fear. She had learned its rhythms, its patterns, the way it rose and fell like waves. She knew that the worst moment was always right before you started moving. Once you took that first step, the fear was still there, but it was different, smaller, more manageable. She took another step, then another. And were already at the command center when she arrived. Came in right behind her, his face pale but determined. Commander stood at the central console, her 4 eyes wide with barely contained terror. "They are everywhere," said. Her voice was tight and controlled, but Sarah could hear the fear underneath. "Every deck, every section, our people are falling." "Not all of them," Sarah said. She pointed to the tactical display. Here and there, small groups were still moving, still functioning. Many of them were teams that had been through the human training program. "We need to rally around those groups. use them as anchors. Stepped forward. I'll coordinate the evacuation protocols, get the civilians to the sheltered areas. I'll handle communications, said. Keep broadcasting the calming protocols. Remind people what they learned. Cracked his knuckles. I will go to the shield generators. They need to stay running. They split up without further discussion. There was no time for long goodbyes or inspirational speeches. The Hollow were here, and every second counted. Sarah stayed in the command center with. The commander's hands were shaking badly, but she was still working, still giving orders, still fighting. Sarah stood beside her and did the same. The Hollow pushed harder. They manifested differently for each person, each species. For though they became logical impossibilities, equations that could not be solved, paradoxes that tangled the mind. For though they were loneliness, silence, the death of all connection. For though they were predators from their evolutionary past, hunters in the dark. For Sarah, they became every mistake she had ever made, every patient she had failed to help, every time she had been too slow, too scared, too human. They whispered that she was foolish to think she could make a difference here, that she was just one small person in a vast and uncaring universe, that fear would always win in the end. She listened to the whispers, she felt their weight, and then she set them aside and kept working. It was not easy, nothing about this was easy, but Sarah had been afraid before, many times, and she had learned something important in all those years of fear. It did not have to stop her, it could push her, it could slow her, it could make her hands shake and her voice waver, but as long as she chose to move, it could not stop her. Across the station, similar battles were being fought, directed evacuation teams through corridors filled with living nightmares. He had been in combat before. He had seen friends die. He had woken up screaming more times than he could count. But he had also learned to function in the middle of chaos, to make decisions while his heart was racing and his mind was full of ghosts. The security teams followed his orders. Some of them were human, some were not. It did not matter. What mattered was that they were moving, working, fighting back against an enemy that had expected them to crumble. His voice filled the station's communication channels, calm, steady, almost musical. She had spent years crafting stories designed to frighten people, and she understood better than most how fear worked, how it could be intensified, how it could be managed. Her words were not magic, but they helped. They reminded people that they were not alone, that the fear they felt was shared, that they could get through this together. Reached the shield generators just as they started to fail. The Hollow were targeting the station's critical systems, trying to cut off escape and trap everyone inside with their nightmares. Worked with hands that would not stop trembling, connecting cables and rerouting power while shadows gathered at the edges of his vision. He had been in darker places than this, colder places, places where hope seemed impossible and death seemed certain. He had survived those places by refusing to quit, by doing the next small thing and then the next, and then the next, until somehow he was still alive and the danger had passed. He did the same thing now, one cable at a time, one connection at a time. The fear screamed at him that he would fail, that it was hopeless, that he should just stop and let the darkness take him. He did not stop. The battle lasted for hours. It felt like days. The Hollow pushed and pushed, trying to find the breaking point, the moment when fear would finally overwhelm the defenders and turn them into empty shells like all the others. That moment never came. The alien officers who had been through the human training program held their ground. They were terrified. They were shaking. Many of them were crying, or whatever their species did instead of crying, but they kept functioning. They completed their objectives. They protected their fellow officers. They did not give in. The Hollow had never encountered anything like this before. They were used to minds that shattered at the first touch of true terror, species that had evolved beyond fear or around it, species that had no defenses against the oldest and darkest emotion. But these creatures, these humans and their students, were different. They felt the fear fully and completely, and they kept going anyway. It was like trying to drown someone who had learned to breathe underwater. As the hours passed, the Hollow's attacks began to weaken, not because the humans and their allies had become less afraid, but because the fear was not stopping them. The Hollow could not feed properly on minds that refused to break. They needed the complete collapse, the total surrender, the moment when terror consumed everything else. When that moment never came, they began to starve. By morning, the station was quiet. The Hollow had retreated, fading back into whatever dark space they had come from. The cost had been high. Many officers had been lost before they could be reached. Many more were traumatized, their minds by the long night of horror. But the station was still standing. And for the first time in the history of the Galactic Coalition, a Hollow attack had been repelled. Sarah found Commander standing at an observation window as the artificial dawn broke over the station. The Commander's 4 eyes were still wide, her body still trembling with residual fear. But she was alive. She was functional. She was still herself. "Your species," said slowly, "is deeply, profoundly broken." Sarah laughed. It was a strange sound in the aftermath of such darkness, but it felt right. "Probably, but we're broken in useful ways." Was quiet for a long moment. Then she made a small gesture that Sarah had learned to recognize as respect. "You taught us something important last night," the Commander said. "Not how to stop being afraid, but how to be afraid and keep going. How to make the fear into a tool instead of a weapon against ourselves." She paused. "The Coalition will need more of your kind, many more, if we are to face the Hollow again and win." Sarah nodded. She thought about the long night, about all the moments when she had wanted to give up, to let the darkness take her, to stop fighting against an enemy that could not be killed. She thought about how she had kept going anyway, one step at a time, one breath at a time. "I'll make some calls," she said. "I know a lot of scared people back on Earth. They've been practicing for this their whole lives." The Coalition Security Forces officially added Human Fear Consultant to their organizational structure the following month. Applications from Earth numbered in the thousands. It turned out that humanity had a lot of experience with being terrified. Horror movie fans, skydivers, deep-sea divers, people who told ghost stories around campfires and then walked home alone through dark woods, people who had faced illness and loss and failure and had somehow found the strength to keep going, people who woke up afraid every morning and went to work anyway. They came from every country, every culture, every walk of life, and they brought with them the strange gift that only humanity seemed to possess, the ability to be scared out of their minds and still function. The Hollow would return. Everyone knew that. They were patient and ancient and hungry, and one defeat would not stop them. But when they came back, they would find something new waiting for them. Not an enemy without fear. That would be impossible. Fear was too fundamental, too deeply woven into the fabric of every thinking mind. But an enemy that had made friends with fear. An enemy that had spent 200,000 years learning to dance with terror instead of being consumed by it. An enemy that told scary stories for fun and jumped out of airplanes for entertainment and walked willingly into nightmares just to see what was there. The Hollow had made a mistake when they came to Meridian Station. They had assumed that fear was always a weakness. They had never met humans before. And now the humans were teaching everyone else what they had learned in all those long dark nights on their small blue world. That fear did not have to be the end. That courage was not the absence of terror, but the decision to keep going despite it. That the darkness was only as powerful as you let it be. Sarah stood at the observation window long after had gone. She watched the stars' wheels slowly past, thinking about all the worlds that were still out there, still vulnerable, still waiting to be protected. She was still afraid. She would probably always be afraid. That was just part of being human. But she was also ready. Ready to teach. Ready to fight. ready to show the galaxy that fear was not an enemy to be conquered but a companion to be understood. It was, she thought, a very human thing to do. And somewhere in the dark between stars, the Hollow stirred restlessly, confused and frustrated by the first defeat they had ever known. They would need a new strategy, a new approach. These strange creatures from the edge of the galaxy had shown them something unexpected. There were beings in the universe who had learned to make fear into an ally. The Hollow did not understand how. They did not understand why. But for the first time in their long existence, they felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. It almost felt like fear.